not a drill, says Daphne B. about mood, memory, and brain from Heart and Soil supplements. To be honest, she says, I thought I would need to be taking these for at least a month before I felt the effects, but I started noticing a significant difference within the first 2 weeks. My anxiety had lowered a lot. I felt it. I can be super anxious over little things, and because of that, I have been a nail biter for the majority of my life. I haven't felt the urge to bite them. In fact, they're the longest they have ever been. I've also been calmer in many work situations. I've been learning new things at work and in a completely different field than anything I've been in before. And I really thought I would be more stressed than I actually am. I feel like I can clearly think and problem solve without having the internal freak out / anxiety attack. I can also remember names better. And oddly enough, I have always been bad at remembering names. I've been surprised. Honestly, I can absolutely feel the difference and it feels so effing good. I also have gut and digestion and fire starter from Heart and Soil supplements. I've started to clean up my diet as well. So these supplements have a chance to work the way they should, as they have. And they have. I'm a believer. I freaking love it. It's so cool. Mood, memory, and brain is one of my favorites at Heart and Soil supplements. You can find us at heartandsoil.co.co. The desiccated brain in there has been studied in humans, in elderly, in terms of cognitive decline and preventing cognitive decline. There is something incredible in brain that we don't know about. There has never been a case of bovine spongiform encephalopathy in New Zealand. That brain is completely safe, and that's all we put in our supplements at Heart and Soil. So check us out. We are here to help you reclaim your birthright to radical health. heartandsoil.co.co. But brain is an incredible supplement for you. It's very hard to get fresh, but in desiccated form, it works really well, especially in mood, memory, and brain when it is combined with liver and bone marrow. Check it out, mood, memory, and brain at heartandsoil.co. My guest on this week's podcast is Lindsey Meehleis. I think that's how I say her name properly. But Lindsey is a midwife, and she has been in practice for 12 years. She's been in the birthing realm for 18. And this was a fun podcast to do. I wanted to do another one for the ladies. I've had a few women on in the past, Al Russ, Jamie Seaman, but it's difficult to find people who have enough experience and are well-versed in pregnancy, preconception, birth, postpartum to really speak about this. So it was awesome to have Lindsey on and talk to her about her experiences. And what she's come to recommend as a diet for these patients is an animal-based diet. And her experiences, her observations are quite striking in terms of placental health, overall health of the fetus, overall health of the baby, overall health of mom, and overall recovery from the pregnancy, as well as fertility. So we touch on a lot of topics here. Like I said, this one is for the ladies and the men who love them, or the women who love them as well. And so if you have someone in your life who is thinking about getting pregnant, who is postpartum, I hope you will share this podcast with them. I hope it will help many, many people. I believe it will. So here we go. Onto the podcast with Lindsey Meehleis. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to talk with all things pregnancy and conception and postpartum with you.
I'm super excited to have you and to talk to you about all those things. For some reason, maybe it's the fact that I walk around without a shirt and eat a lot of meat. My audience on most social media is mostly dudes, but I know there are a lot of women out there who ask questions. Can women eat an animal-based diet? What does this mean for women? And I get all kinds of questions, and we get questions at Heart and Soil all the time about pregnancy and preconception and postpartum. And so this podcast is for the ladies. And so if men are listening to this, they can give it to the ladies that they love. And I know that a lot of ladies are going to be excited about this, because whenever I do a podcast for ladies, it always gets tons of engagement. It's just that I guess, walking around with spears and cutting meat on Instagram doesn't always engage women, which we'll get to. I have questions for you about why you think that might be. But first, will you start with the story of your recent birth? You sent me an email as we were coordinating this, and you said, I just got out of this really long birth. And you said, I've seen 3 placental abruptions. You might want to tell the audience what a placental abruption is. You said, I've seen 3 placental abruptions in my career, and they were all a certain type of person. And I guess you had a placental abruption in a recent birth. So will you start with that story? What's common among the placental abruptions, what a placental abruption is, and maybe, a little bit about placental health and how you correlate it with what you see women eating?
Yeah, I think that's the elephant in the room for sure. This is the question I usually get asked the most about, placentas and vegetarian/vegan diets. And I the placenta abruption is basically the placenta is attached to the uterine wall. And what can happen sometimes in the birth process, and sometimes even prior to the birth process, is the placenta can start to peel off the uterine wall. And so we can get either partial placental abruptions or full placental abruptions. And both are really dangerous. They usually include some sort of vaginal bleeding. And it's something that, like, obviously this is the nutrient house for the baby. And if the placenta starts to come off the uterine wall, then we can have some pretty severe consequences for the baby. As long as we recognize it and move forward, we can usually make sure that there's no catastrophic adverse events, but it is something that it's a very dangerous situation. So I've been a midwife for 12 years, but I've been in the birth world for close to 19 years. And over the last almost 19 years, I've seen 3 placental abruptions in my practice. And all 3 of them were vegetarian. And then I had a full placental abruption, and that was a raw vegan. And this is anecdotal. We actually just looked right before we started this podcast, and there's nothing that's in the medical literature that has to do with the significance of a vegan or vegetarian diet and placental health. But it's something that, as midwives talking, in peer review, we commonly see that same thing. There's several midwives that won't even take vegetarian or vegan clients. I take them in the hopes that I can change their nutrition throughout their pregnancy, because I really want them to focus on what they're craving. And you will always hear those vegetarian or vegan moms say that they're craving meat. So, my sister was a vegetarian for 25 years. And the second she got pregnant, I tried preconception, but the second she got pregnant, I'm like, you have no other choice. You will start eating meat. And she lives in Sweden, and her husband actually went out and got them a moose. And she had like the most beautiful moose meat throughout her whole pregnancy. And now she's like almost full carnivore. So her body just felt so good in that state that she just craves it all the time now.
I spoke to another, I believe it was a doula or a midwife. I believe it was a doula who had a midwife friend. And the quote from this woman on Instagram that she shared with me was that all of the vegetarian placentas and vegan placentas that she had seen looked like the placentas of smokers. Have you ever delivered a smoker's baby? How many women are still smoking in their pregnancy?
Yeah, thankfully I have not. I'm sure that there's people that are using cannabis as a medicine throughout their pregnancy, but I think that's going to have a lot different effect on the placenta than nicotine would. But I have not seen somebody that has smoked nicotine throughout their pregnancy's placenta. I have seen pictures, obviously, and I would very much correlate what a vegan or vegetarian placenta looks like to that of a smoker's. The quality, the consistency, the color, the calcification, it's not healthy. Like, you're growing an organ inside of you that's specifically for this pregnancy, that's specifically for this baby. And if that optimal health isn't there, like, you need to eat those organs and that meat in order to have that placenta be of the, most optimal health. It's essential.
When I'm trying to think the first time I saw a placenta, it might've been when I was in college. I went to Costa Rica, and I was pre-med at the time, and I live in Costa Rica now, but I was on the east coast of Costa Rica in a hospital in Limon. And they said, well, how old are you? And I said, oh, I'm in college. I said, oh, you're in medical school? I said, no, I'm in college. And they put me right in the emergency room, because I went to a hospital as like an intern, and they let me, they was helping deliver babies. And I'm pretty sure I saw a placenta for the first time then, but I was struck by the complexity of this thing. To me, it looked like a pretty large, thick blood and vessel pancake. That may sound gross, but it's really a pretty incredible thing.
Good description.
How would you describe a placenta to somebody that's never seen a placenta? I imagine most women are familiar with what a placenta is, or maybe they've seen it, but maybe not. Like, what does a placenta look like?
So it looks like an organ. It doesn't look exactly like a liver, but it does have that same like gelatinous consistency to it. Usually is about the size of your hand or bigger. And I've seen placentas much bigger than that before. But if anything's smaller than the size of my hand, I really start to worry about what mom's nutrition was like prenatally. And then I usually see lower birth weight babies with placentas that are smaller than the size of my hand. It has what's called cotyledons, which are these spongy type tissues that will stick to the inside of the uterus. And then there's the fetal side. So the fetal side is kind of, if you turn it over, the placenta over, it looks like the tree of life. So it has all these beautiful vessels that go up that attach to the cord insertion. And then the cord insertion takes the umbilical cord over to the baby's belly button. And so, they're beautiful. You look at this placenta and you're like, this is the original tree of life here. Like, it's just absolutely stunning. And so lucky for me, I get the cream of the crop where I have people that are seeking home birth, because I only do home births, and they're coming into this as more alternative, more health friendly. There you go. There's some good pictures of it. And so I get people that tend to be in really good health. And so I usually see just absolutely stunning placentas most of the time. It's funny, I just posted a picture of me holding a placenta on my Instagram this morning. So, but yeah, no, the placentas, you can absolutely tell mother's health by how her placenta looks.
It makes sense. Here's an organ that mom is growing over the course of 9 months of pregnancy. And we don't get to see mom's other organs. We don't get to see mom's liver or mom's heart or mom's pancreas or mom's spleen or mom's kidneys, usually when they're birthing a baby. But you get to see this placenta. You get to see this organ that they grew. So it makes sense that it would be a reflection of their health. And how interesting. It's just observational. It's anecdotal. I wish we had more consistent research about this. But you and I both know that the medical establishment is biased toward plant-based diets for crazy reasons and away from animal-based diets for nonsensical reasons. And so it's hard to get this research done, but it is so interesting that in your experience, in the experience of doulas and midwives that I've connected with through Instagram, and then the experience of your colleagues as well, that there's this consistent observation that placental health essentially correlates with animal foods in the diet. Would you agree with that statement?
100%.
What about eating placenta? How many of your clients eat their placenta?
So I would say probably close to 98, 99%. It's very rare that I get somebody that doesn't encapsulate their placenta. And there's different ways to do it. So there's the traditional Chinese medicine of encapsulating it. So the placenta encapsulator, which I don't do, but someone will take the placenta and they'll steam it, and then they will dehydrate it and grind it up and then stick it in the capsules. Then there's a way that you can use it as a homeopathic, where you take raw pieces of the placenta and put it in a sort of grain alcohol. People will use that for like teething or the baby's constitutional remedy in homeopathy throughout their life. Other people will just eat it raw. If I have somebody that's had a significant bleed in the immediate right after the birth, I will actually take a chunk of the placenta and have them stick it in their mouth. And it helps so much with the bleeding reducing at that moment. So I use it as a medicine if I need to. It's really rare that I really get any postpartum hemorrhages, but I definitely see it as a medicine in that moment. And then what we can do as well is we can blend up the placenta. I use water in it, and then I stick it in ice cube trays, and then the mom can pop out a little ice cube and make it into some sort of smoothie throughout the postpartum recovery phase.
Do you see, again, this is observational. Do you see women who consume their placenta do better in the postpartum phase?
Yes. And I don't know the actual studies, but I know that there definitely has been some data on it that shows like mothers that, have had more than one child and hadn't encapsulated previously, and then encapsulated, with subsequent pregnancies, where they notice a difference in their energy. They notice a difference in their postpartum depression and anxiety levels, where they're much more balanced, and they just feel so much better. So I definitely see that. There's moms that are like, I would never not go without, encapsulating my placenta at another birth again. So, my son, he's 13 almost, and I still have a couple of his placenta pills left over from my pregnancy with him that are in my freezer. So they're kind of good indefinitely. And if I ever have a heavy cycle, I will actually go to my freezer and get out 1 or 2 placenta pills. And it helps significantly with how I feel. It's like my own personal medicine. I grew this organ. Why would I not consume it?
Interesting. Organs are powerful regardless. We'll talk about that a little later in the podcast as well. Are you familiar, this is a left field question, with any indigenous cultures that eat the placenta? Is this, I didn't think to research this before the podcast. I can do a little digging right now in real time, but do you know of any cultures that eat the placenta? Any hunter-gatherer cultures?
So I would say that probably most of them did. And here's the reason. If we had an organ that started to rot and we were, in a cave, then we would that would be a problem for like a predator outside. So you look at most animals will always eat that placenta, chew through the cord. I don't really see my clients chew through the cords, but they usually are always eating their placenta. So I don't know specific cultures that do it, but I know that it's definitely something that has been, our ancestors have passed it down through the generations for sure. And when we moving away from organ-based eating, I think that the stigma went along with that placenta as well, especially when birth got moved to the hospital.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm looking at an article now. Shared here.
A lot of placentas are sold, actually.
Really?
They, put it away as medical waste, but you can look and see there's, the stem cells, that they're rich in stem cells. There's like placental creams. I mean, there's tons of stuff that we know that placenta is good for. We could even go into the whole cord banking industry and how that's been created, and how people are paying thousands of dollars every single month to have these nutrient-rich stem cells stuck in a freezer for the chance of what if. And I always argue, what if we gave them those stem cells instead? Would we even have the problems that are causing what we might need to treat that's sitting in the freezer later on?
Right. Let's talk about that a little bit. Isn't there a practice that you can do after the baby's born where you leave the cord attached, right? There's like, the placenta actually has a heartbeat, or has a beat, doesn't it? There's a placental rhythm and a beat.
There's a pulsation. So yes. So when the baby comes out, the placenta is still attached to the uterine wall. And typically what happens in like the normal Western medical birth is that there's a active management of the third stage of birth. The third stage of birth is the delivery of the placenta. And so very commonly, even while that placenta is still attached and the cord is still pulsating, which we know it's giving that baby that really good nutrient, oxygen rich blood, the obstetricians and midwives will go in and they'll start to kind of pull down the cord and get that placenta to come down, and massage the top of the fundus of the uterus, and that placentas are usually born within like anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes at the hospital. And what I started doing in my practice, and really how I practice midwifery in general, is very instinct based. So anytime that I'm doing something that I was taught or doing something that I had read, if it doesn't feel intuitive to me, I always start to question and be like, well, why the heck am I doing this? And I always go back to what I call great grandma wisdom. So, when I was in midwifery school and when I did all my preceptorship, I was watching these placentas be yanked out of women, and it wasn't instinctual at all. And so what I started realizing is if we left that alone, and that cord pulsated. So sometimes the cord stopped pulsating like after 60 seconds after birth. And I've seen cords pulsate up to 85 minutes after birth before. I don't know why. There's nothing that I can say like this is a definitive reason why one baby's cord pulsates longer than the other. But what I usually see are the babies that are having a little bit slower transition into like figuring out how to breathe and like co-regulate with mom on the outside. Those are the cords that I see pulsate longer. And so for me, anytime that I would ever think about cutting the cord, I would think that I would be taking away one of the most incredible lifelines that would be fully to my benefit in an out of hospital birth situation. If I have a NICU in the back, then who cares if the baby needs to be whisked off and intubated, but that's not normal birth either. So usually my placentas are born within 60 minutes or so. The moms are usually the one that reaches down and kind of guides it out with the cord. And then I don't cut that cord until the baby's had a breastfeeding on the outside. So that was their powerhouse. That was what gave them all the nutrition throughout the whole pregnancy. They don't know if that cord is cut, that there's a source of nourishment out here. So I really try to make sure like I have the conversation with baby as we're cutting the cord. Like, now you're going to nurse out here. You just had mommy's really good milk. And before we take that placenta away, I want you to know that this is going to be your safe spot for nourishment. And we kind of make it a ritual before we cut that cord and take it away.
That's incredible. That's really cool. And then you're going to save the placenta. Like you said, the majority of women are going to eat the placenta, encapsulate it in some way, shape, or form. It makes sense. There's nutrients in there. You grew that organ, put it back. I think a lot of women, and we can talk about this next, are probably not eating, maybe your clients are, but a lot of women are not eating enough animal foods. And so consuming the placenta is probably a really rich source of nutrients on top of their probably too many chicken Caesar salads. But let's talk a little bit about placental stem cells. I mean, what are people doing with those? Banking them? They're banking them for, and I guess the pulsations are going to move the stem cells into the baby, right? If the longer you leave it connected to the baby, the more stem cells presumably are going to go to the baby.
Correct. So there was a study that was done, I believe it was in the 1950s. I remember reading it, gosh, probably 20 years ago. And what they saw was there was a baby that they left on a scale for 30 minutes following birth, and they measured the weight in grams of the baby the whole 30 minutes. And so they would see like at this differentiation, the cord was still intact. So they would see the like pulsation of the cord, and then the baby would cry, and then it would kind of like push back a little bit, and then the cord would pulsate and the baby would cry. And like there was this little differentiation in weight. And the only reason we don't know that there's not that benefit that goes past 30 minutes is because that's how long the study was. And so we know how nutrient dense the cord, the oxygen, and all those blood cells is, the stem cells. It's a powerhouse. And in my opinion, it's all these basically like antioxidants that are protecting baby from the birth experience that they just had. And I use it protection as like loosely, because birth is as real as life gets, and it's something that's very normal, but it's a very big process to be born. And so when the baby's coming through the birth canal, what happens is there's a compression. So science says anywhere from like 30 to 50% of the baby's blood supply gets pushed back into the placenta at that final squeeze of birth. And so when the baby is born, the pulsation is actually giving the baby back what was their blood supply. And so if we cut that cord right away, and then we take it away and we go suck all the blood out of it and stick it in a freezer, then those babies are being born deficient immediately at birth. They're not in their optimal state at all. They're, in this kind of shock state where they're, born deficient in iron, maybe deficient in oxygen. There's so many different things that can happen when we cut that cord right away. There was a TED Talk that was actually done maybe like 2015 or so. And it was a doctor that's like was saying like the most important thing we can do for children like throughout all of the world is have optimal cord closure. And he was advocating, I think, for 3 minutes, but he was just saying like that's the most important thing we can give these children, because for them to not be born iron deficient and not be born, oxygen deprived, that we can take these 3 minutes and change the whole world. And I agree with them. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do is really give these babies the optimal start to their life, instead of take this blood and then send it away to a freezer that you're spending lots of money on with the potential of never using it. So if I ever have anybody that comes to me saying that they want to do stem cell collection, part of my agreement for it is that I will not even think about touching that cord until it stopped pulsating. And then at that point, we're getting such little blood that is it even worth freezing it? So I always let them make that decision with what comes out of it. But it's a very small amount compared to what you would get in a modern day obstetrical community.
So this person in the TED Talk was advocating for letting the cord pulse for 3 minutes before they clamped it. Is that correct?
That was just like, let me find. I think his name was, hold on, I'll find it. But he was saying 3 minutes would just be like the like little piece for doctors to remember. Like I said, I've seen cords pulsate way longer than that. So to me, 3 minutes is nothing, but it's a start for sure.
I caught a couple of babies when I was in medical school. And as I recall, they clamped the cord pretty fast in the hospital.
Right away.
Immediately. And what we learned in medical school, probably the justification for that was, if you don't clamp the cord, the babies have an increased incidence of neonatal jaundice. What do you think about that? I mean, I guess
that's the study that's thrown around. I hear it all the time. But guess what? There was no clamps in our caves. There's no clamps for all of time. And so they're looking at something that there's really no comparison, because that's actually like the physiological process compared to a medical based process. So who's to say what's right and what's wrong? But I would 100% argue that the physiological process of optimal cord closure is what's essential for human life,
Yeah, I can't imagine that they're clamping the cord in the African bush. When I was in Africa, I didn't see any childbirth, but I mean, have you had an interest in this as a midwife for your whole career? What happens in quote unquote wild humans? How do the Hadza give birth? I guess most of these hunter-gatherer indigenous cultures are now vanished from the planet, but what do we know anthropologically about how humans gave birth before hospitals? I mean, didn't the women just go into the forest or the bush with some, comrade women and birth the baby on their own?
Yeah, it's like such a beautiful, wise piece that's missing so much in our modern day culture about birth, because birth is made to work or we wouldn't be here as a human species. It's the one guaranteed thing about life. You were born and you're going to die. Like that's the one thing that we know is going to happen no matter what. And so for us to have lost that trust. So we look at it in this modern day culture that like there's, birth is an emergency waiting to happen. And so that's kind of like the general motto for obstetricians. And I love obstetricians. I have several friends that are obstetricians. I'm so grateful that they're there when we need them. But in terms of low risk women, we have completely medicalized so much of this process that we've lost the art of birth, like it's just a science experiment currently with what's happening. And so when we look at ancient culture, and again, I go always back to like great grandma wisdom. What would your great grandma do? What would your great 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 grandma do in the field? And they would be hunting and gathering, and they would be squatting, and they would be carrying water to and from their watering hole, and they would be eating organs from the kill that their husband brought home, and they would recognize and know that those things were actually really good for them. And then usually what happened in communal type situations is that you had your aunties and your grandma and your mom and your sisters that surrounded you during that time and made you really feel supported and loved. And I don't think that most of them came from a place of fear, which is it's fear porn. That's all we hear now in modern day birth. And usually it's from interventions that we hear all these bad stories. And so we take a step back, and if we look at what modern day birth has created, but then we take a step back even further and say like, no, like let's go back to the roots of this, and like, how do we have a deep reverence for birth? I know you're a surfer, and I in the ocean all the time. And so you would never enter into the ocean with just this like, dumbfounded trust. Like, no, nothing's going to happen. You enter into the ocean always with a deep reverence for what the ocean can do. To me, it's the same exact thing for birth. Like every time that I get in that ocean, I almost like ask the ocean for an invitation to enter into its waters. And before I walk into a birth, I like ask for like an invitation to enter into this sacred space to be a birth keeper for this mom that's bringing new life into this world. So it's taking out that modern day medical aspect and bringing this spiritual sacredness back into it.
I love it. Now, what about the position that women give birth in the hospital, this lithotomy position where they're on their backs with their legs up? It's very convenient for the obstetrician, but I see on your Instagram, a lot of your births happen in like hot tubs or water, where the woman looks like they're seated more upright. What do you think about positioning for the woman to give birth?
Yeah, I think positioning should always be intuitive with the mother. I usually always really try to avoid ever telling a position, a mother to get in a certain position, because you'll see them in one position, all of a sudden they'll just like lean over really fast, and you're like, okay, cool. That's what her pelvis needed to do at that moment. Most of the time, if a client is in a birth tub, they're squatting in some way, shape, or form, which opens up the pelvic outlet by about 33%. And that's a very normal physiological process of birth. Like that's just what we do. It's, we would go and squat in the field per se and have our babies. Lithotomy position, that's because everybody has epidurals usually that are giving birth in the hospital. So they can't move unless you have a nurse that is skilled enough to go find the squat bar that attaches to the hospital bed and lift the bed up enough to get you into that position. But that's not convenient for the doctors at all. They put their little stools there, they raise the bed up, and it's just right there. I mean, I can't even tell you how many different positions I've caught babies in, and, birth tubs and bathroom floors and backs of closets and you name it. Like, I mean, yesterday I was in a jacuzzi with somebody giving birth. So there's just so many different variations that can happen with birth if we allow it to happen the way that nature's intended.
Let's talk a little about epidurals. Do women need these?
Yes.
I would imagine the women that you're helping with their birth don't get epidurals.
Yeah, no, I have a 0% epidural rate because I don't offer them.
Right.
Need is a funny word, right? Like, I think it's a modern day word that we could say for pain relief. It's like, I would never walk into somebody's house and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your pain scale? And it's birth is normal. And we have this normal physiological experience of how we can take the trust that we bring into it, how we can have the comfort of others helping us through this process and releasing fears around birth that will significantly decrease the pain. Now, if I have somebody strapped to a hospital bed, strapped to a hospital monitor and telling them that they can't move, and then I have somebody coming in and telling you every 10 minutes, do you want the epidural yet? Do you want the epidural yet? The anesthesiologist is down the hall. Everybody's going to want an epidural. You're in a very vulnerable state. It's, I equate birth to like a psychedelic experience where you have to completely surrender or you will have a really bad time. And if you're not surrendering, you're fighting your body. So the work that I do prenatally with my clients is so much about alleviating that fear and then having that deep trusting relationship where they know that like they're here to rely on me, but I'm also here to like identify if things start coming up and be there for them in those moments. And that relationship that just is like deeply anchored throughout the prenatal process moves into the birth. And it's beautiful. It's so sacred. I can't even tell you, my clients leave as family after they give birth. I don't think many people that are in the medical profession can say that when their, patients leave.
No, I don't think so. And I'm thinking that maybe I want to start talking about the pregnancy nutrition and even preconception nutrition, but I had this thought that perhaps some sort of psychedelic experience should be recommended preconception for many of these women.
I mean,
learn how to let go.
Yes,
and their partners.
And that's a taboo topic in our culture, but I would definitely agree with that statement for sure.
Yeah. I had a previous podcast with Dan Engel on MDMA and other psychedelics. If listeners are interested in that kind of stuff, I've gone down the rabbit hole a little bit, but yeah, I will tell you from personal experience and from what I understand of other psychedelics, it is a process of letting go. That is true. You must be willing to go on the ride, no matter where it takes you. Yes. Let's shift gears a little bit. We talked a lot about the actual birthing process. Let's talk about what you've seen during the pregnancy process in the clients that you work with in terms of blood work, in terms of labs, in terms of overall health with different dietary strategies. Okay, so yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast is because you have experience with animal-based diets and you're somebody that's an advocate for animal-based diets. And I think that's awesome to give women that freedom. What have you seen in your practice? What juxtapositions, what differences, and what have you seen in terms of blood work and overall health of mom and baby based on preconception or during pregnancy nutrition or even postpartum nutrition?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm sure that you'll agree with this statement that when we go through the process of school, we're taught certain things that are just very like dogmatic, like this is how it is and this is why we do what we do, and you really don't have an opportunity to reach outside of that bubble. And midwifery is definitely more holistic in a sense, where we're taught things like nutrition in school. But what I was taught about nutrition in school was definitely not, an animal-based diet. It was, get your leafy greens and get your, grains and all these different things. And so while I was grateful that we had the education of nutrition, it's nothing that I would consider optimal nutrition at all. And so I have weaved my way through this journey of midwifery with always questioning everything. And anytime that I start to see a trend with women feeling a certain way, like I always look to see like, how can we do things different? And the one thing that I've noticed that has just completely blown my mind with how women are feeling is really, really, really advocating for women to get these nutrient-dense organs, these nutrient-dense foods into their system. And that should be pretty much common sense. Like, why would we not want, this is the time where they need it the most. But we've moved so far away, like, my first trimester, I'm so unhealthy. Like, I haven't been drinking my green smoothies. And I'm like, I don't care if you're drinking your green smoothies, like go eat a steak. Last week I had a phone call from somebody and she was saying, I'm online reading and what I'm reading is that I should not eat steak. And if I do, it has to be well done. And I was like, does that sound good to you? And she's like, no, I don't even want to eat a steak if it's well done. I'm like, go cook the steak how you want to eat it. Eat a good source of steak. Make sure you're not getting it from who knows, McDonald's or whatever. I don't think McDonald's has steak, but, make sure that you're eating something that intuitively you would eat normally without going on Dr. Google and saying what Dr. Google says. I actually have some of the testimonial that I posted on my Instagram, and I just wanted to read a couple of things because I found it really beautiful. I love having that feedback. So this was from a client that's had 3 pregnancies with me, and she said, this raw beef liver are what took me from barely surviving to functioning well. That's something I hear very, very frequently. Another one is best supplement I've ever taken, best prenatal out there. The only thing that ever made my hemoglobin up, I noticed my blood circulation improved drastically. The only thing that's ever changed my hemoglobin besides eating my placenta postpartum, literally felt a burst of energy every single time I took these. I was so sluggish before. So those are real important words to me. I want everybody to feel like that in pregnancy. In general, I want everybody to feel like that. And you don't hear that about much anything else. When do you hear somebody say those words, So we started recommending specifically your products in pregnancy, I would say within the last 18 months to 2 years, with in the start of COVID. That's how I kind of found you. And it's what I typically have women on is the beef liver and bone marrow supplement, and then the lifeblood. I want to hear what you have to say about what you would consider an optimal prenatal vitamin. I don't recommend people take a prenatal vitamin. I recommend that we supplement with these real types of foods. I also think that some women would really benefit from the fire starter just for those fats. Most women would benefit from that. But is there anything else that you would think that would be beneficial? Because that's a question I got a lot on my Instagram page, is what would be the ideal prenatal for, preconception and pregnancy and postpartum?
Yeah, we can talk about it. And just so you guys listening, no, I didn't pay Lindsey to say any of that. I had no idea. She was going to say that about heart and soil. I mean, we love that people are benefiting from our desiccated organ supplements. I think fresh organs are the best, but if people won't or can't get fresh organs, we're glad that we do something at the desiccated stuff at Heart and Soil. I didn't know you were going to say that, but thanks for that feedback on that stuff. There were a couple of, you shared with me from your Instagram some of the questions from your audience, so we can make sure we get to those. So I think that in terms of prenatals, the main reason that women take prenatals, at least in the mainstream society, is folate, because folate deficiency is associated with spinal, neural crest deformations in spina bifida and things like this. So you want to make sure you're getting enough folate. Now, where do women get folate? They get it from egg yolks. They get it from liver. Those are probably the best sources of folate. So I think women who are in pregnancy should definitely have egg yolks, either cooked or raw. Now, I want to talk to you about raw foods, because this is something that I always scratch my head on about in the future. When women say, can I eat raw egg yolks or can I eat raw liver during pregnancy? And I think, let me think about this. So let's bookmark that for a moment from now. But egg yolks and liver, I think, are the best sources of folate, though women may be able to get folate from leafy greens. My concern is that much of the folate is heat labile and is destroyed or denatured by cooking or heating. And the leafy greens are going to carry with them, from my perspective, a lot of other negative things for women, either oxalates or isothiocyanates, which especially in pregnancy could be problematic. Those are compounds that are going to inhibit the absorption of iodine and prevent optimal thyroid function. And if you're growing a baby, you want your thyroid to work really well. You don't want to be giving yourself goitrogenic compounds like isothiocyanates. The list goes on and on of other problematic things in leafy greens. For humans, phytic acid, things that are going to prevent nutrient absorption. A lot of this conversation in a moment between you and I can be about iron as well, and iron deficiency anemia in pregnancy. And so lots of these defense chemicals in vegetables will prevent the absorption or assimilation of minerals like iron and can contribute to iron deficiency anemia. That is what things like phytic acid and oxalates essentially do in our gut. So I think that in terms of a prenatal formulation, in terms of vitamins and minerals, you want to think about folate. So that's egg yolks and liver. You want to think about riboflavin as well, because sometimes women get iron deficiency anemia that is uncorrected by iron, and that can be a riboflavin deficiency. Riboflavin is a very interesting B vitamin that we don't really hear about much. I mean, I didn't get any nutritional training in PA school, medical school, or residency. So my training was even worse in nutrition than yours. But But we never hear about riboflavin in general. I was never taught that in medical school, that iron deficiency anemia could be riboflavin deficiency. But riboflavin is generally found in liver and heart. Those are the best sources. Egg yolks are okay, but not as good. There's actually some riboflavin in the egg white as well. But again, we're back to animal source foods. It's very hard, I think, for men or women to meet their requirements for riboflavin if they are not eating animal organs, primarily liver and heart, and maybe egg whites and egg yolks. Those are the main things. Now, I purposely left out muscle meat from both of those conversations about folate and riboflavin because muscle meat doesn't have nearly as much riboflavin as organ meats like heart and liver. And muscle meat really doesn't have much folate at all. So the conversation around folate and riboflavin is also relevant for those who have the MTHFR polymorphism, which is important in pregnancy. So this is a little technical, but it's the MTHFR, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. There's two common polymorphisms, 677C to T and 1298. I forget what the base pair translation is there, but these are found on things like a 23andMe test will tell you. But what I would do from my perspective as a physician, I would just make sure that the woman or the man has a homocysteine below 8. You want to keep the homocysteine low. So even if you have an MTHFR polymorphism, if your homocysteine is low, then you're pretty clear, presuming that your B12 is normal and your MMA, which is methylmalonic acid. It's getting a little technical now, guys. Sorry, which is an indication of B12 status. Presuming that your B12 is okay, and these other metrics of folate status are normal. If your homocysteine is less than 8, to me it indicates that you have enough riboflavin or enough folate. So that would be the metric to look at there. Now, I think that for most women, the desiccated organ supplements would be fine. Just keep a track of that homocysteine and even the blood levels of folate. It's pretty hard to check blood levels of riboflavin, but I do think fresh organs are better than desiccated, and we should recommend fresh organs first. The desiccated are really there as a support system if people can't or they want more supplementation on top of the fresh organs. So then that's essentially my idea of a prenatal. So if I were going to make a prenatal food, it would be like a little bit of liver, a robust amount of heart, maybe some spleen for women, because spleen has a ton of heme iron, and spleen will correct the appearance, the phenotype of a placenta reminds me of a spleen. Those two organs look the most similar to me. I've joked that a spleen is like a blood sandwich, and that's not to be gross, it's just to describe it to people. And I think that the placenta is pretty vascular and spongy. It's kind of like a spleen. So it would be liver and heart and spleen would be great because the spleen is going to give the heme iron and the other nutrients. So those would be the organs that I would want women to focus on in pregnancy. It's pretty hard to eat raw spleen. It's pretty hard to eat cooked spleen. I think desiccated gets to be really valuable here as well. Maybe even some blood, like some desiccated blood. So that's in our lifeblood supplement from Heart and Soil is blood, spleen, and liver. The new supplement Warrior has heart and liver. And then, like you said, the bone marrow is probably important for the fat. And then animal fat in general is critical for women. You can use Firestarter, but you could also use tallow or grass-fed butter, preferably raw butter, or just a really fatty steak. And this is going to depend on what the woman or the man does. If we're talking about a woman in pregnancy in terms of her nausea, I wanted to ask you about nausea as well. But what is your experience with women eating raw food? You said that some women were eating raw liver. It's like, there's this hesitation. I think most raw liver is pretty darn safe. I always have to put the caveat there, the asterisk, that raw food is has a potential for contamination. You better know the source. If you're going to eat raw liver, whether you're a man or a woman who's pregnant or a woman who's not pregnant, that stuff better be from a really good source. It's probably important to get it frozen, deep frozen as much as you can. But it's just, I never want to recommend raw organs to a woman in pregnancy and have there be a bad outcome. But have you experienced women eating raw organs with any positive or negative outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, tread lightly here, right? Like, I don't want this to be like, oh, Lindsey and Paul said to go eat raw everything. But, my disclaimer to this is that, first of all, always trust your intuition. If there's something that you're eating that does not feel right to you, then don't eat it. Like if you're like, ooh, I don't know if I feel about eating this raw beef liver right now, don't eat it. But then also let's talk about how you can get sick from eating spinach. Like there could be so many different things that are, contaminated on spinach that we don't even talk about. So first and foremost, always make sure that you're getting your foods from a trusted source. I have lots of clients that are doing raw organs. I have lots of clients that are doing raw milk. I have lots of clients that are doing raw eggs, and I've never seen a bad outcome, knock on wood.
And how many clients are we talking about now? Probably hundreds, if not thousands at this point. Hundreds. Yeah. Yes. It's just N of a few hundred.
Thousands. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to get the number. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things that you always tread lightly, but the most important part of the piece of midwifery care that I like to bring in is giving the autonomy back to my clients and being like, if you feel like you want to go eat raw liver, go eat raw liver. You don't need permission from somebody to go do so. And it's animalistic, right? Like that's something that is in our ancestral DNA to eat this way. So I feel like when women do start eating this way, they really feel nourished. And, again, if you're getting it from the local rancher or like the store that then the chances of getting sick are really, really, really rare, in my opinion, just as much as the chance of getting sick from eating a spinach salad or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there is some data about that. I could pull it up. I've talked about it previously, but if you look, at least in terms, I believe I'm wrong. I'm correct on this. I believe I'm right about this. That there are more incidents of food poisoning from vegetables than there are from animals every year, and certainly the incidence of any problems with raw milk is very, very, very low. In medical school, we're taught don't have women eat raw cheese because of the potential contamination of listeria, which is a pretty big problem during pregnancy. But again, it's like, well, raw cheese or raw milk could have a lot of benefits for a woman in pregnancy. And how do you navigate that here in Costa Rica?
Yeah, like where's the risk benefit analysis there?
Life is risky, right? And I think that generally in medical school, they were saying, don't have them eat raw Spanish cheeses, with kind of the inference or the suggestion being like, if you don't know the quality of that raw milk, then maybe. But again, huge asterisk. This whole section of the conversation with me and Lindsey is not meant to be any sort of medical advice. Make your own decisions if you're a pregnant or pre-conception woman. All raw food has risks. But then again, so does malnutrition, and a lot of raw foods or lightly cooked organs can be incredibly nutritious for humans as well. The other option for a lot of women is to lightly cook something like heart, leaving the inside rare, to lightly sear the liver if they want to eat fresh liver, or desiccated organs are pretty darn safe in terms of that stuff. We do really strict quality control in terms of contamination. So that's a safe source of that as well. But again, I think the fresh are the recommendation there. But raw milk is a hard thing. If I were a woman, I would not want to give up raw milk. Raw goat's milk is a very enjoyable part of my diet now, and I wouldn't want to give that up. I certainly wouldn't want to give up raw butter, things like this during my pregnancy. And so it's an interesting thing to consider.
And that's what women were always eating. Like we've never had the pasteurization process, throughout all of civilization, we've always been eating these foods raw. So it's like, let's look back, like let's go back 100 years, maybe 150 years ago and see like when all of this actually started. And then let's look at our general overall health right now. Are we healthier people? Hell no. And so we have to, take all these little pieces into consideration when we think about what optimal health really stands for.
What dosing, do you give your clients any recommendations on dosing for liver? Do you let them do it intuitively? This comes up all the time, and we can both address it from our own perspectives. Is there a concern for vitamin A toxicity in pregnancy? It's a really interesting rabbit hole, but I'd love to get your take on it.
Yeah, I'm intuitive always. And it's kind of interesting when I start with that in my conversations with my clients, when I say, go and if they're eating raw liver or if they're taking the pills, like go and see what it is that you need. Like if you're taking the pill, like put 3 in your hand and see how that feels. And then put like 4 in your hand and see how that feels. And then if you feel like you need more later in the day, add more in later in the day. And that's definitely like not a standard way to make a recommendation for any type of supplement or medication. But I think it takes away our intuitive power. So as much as I would love to like fully have medicine step back into that, I don't think it will ever happen. But if we can start planting those seeds, I think it's essential. The vitamin A toxicity is definitely something that comes up. And then I also always hear like, well, what about the liver being the filter for all the toxins? And does that mean that, we're getting all the toxins from the liver? And there's just so much misinformation out there. And, I would love if you addressed the vitamin A. And then I don't know if you want to move into the copper part of it too, but there's this vitamin A copper toxicity thing that just keeps looming. I feel like on social media that, that's just like the number one kind of fear that people have around this.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting. So my perspective on liver is that it's not a filter. It's like, I think we're both pretty safely in that camp. I think most people who understand human physiology know that the liver is not a filter. It doesn't act like a sieve. This is not I don't think many people listening to this podcast eat pasta or spaghetti, but this is not a sieve catching the spaghetti after you've cooked it. And your liver isn't just full of toxic spaghetti that it's caught, and filtered out of your body. The liver is a enzymatic factory that biotransforms things. So it'll take compounds that are toxins and it'll make them water soluble, or it'll bioconvert them so that you can excrete them or you can bind them. And so basically it prepares them for excretion. So it takes one widget and it changes the shape of that widget and then it exports it out the back door, and that's either poop or pee. But the liver doesn't really store those things at all. So you're not going to accumulate toxins in the liver. Having said that, the sources of the liver is important, because if it's a poorly fed cow or a cow from a toxic area, of course, they're going to have more toxins in the body, but the liver generally doesn't hold on to toxins. Some people would say heavy metals, but if you look at it, so there's a farm that I love in Georgia called White Oak Pastures, and they've sent me their analysis of heavy metals in the organs. The kidneys actually store more heavy metals than the liver. The liver is pretty low in heavy metals. And so I think that the kidneys are not incredibly high, but the kidneys are higher than the liver. So when I tell people I'd say eat less kidney than you do liver, or eat a marginal or a small amount of kidney. Kidney's still valuable, I think, for a lot of people, especially perhaps people with urinary issues or people that want vitamin A in smaller doses. The kidney is also a source of DAO, which is diamine oxidase, which is a valuable antihistaminergic thing for people that have sort of histamine problems and they're trying to work those out. But I'm not saying the kidney is toxic, just that the kidney is even higher in heavy metals than the liver, and neither of them are very high in general. So the liver is pretty darn safe, especially from a good source like White Oak Pastures. In terms of the vitamin A levels, I think that the recommendations are less than 10,000 IUs for a pregnant woman per day, which is fine. You can stay below 10,000 IUs by eating less than 2 ounces of liver per day. If my calculations are correct, I think that's right. I think an ounce of liver has a little more than 5,000 IUs of vitamin A per day. So I don't even think pregnant women need that much liver. I think I'd be happy if a pregnant woman is getting half an ounce of liver throughout the week, or an average of 3.5 ounces per week is plenty for most women in terms of the liver. You could go a little higher if you wanted to do an ounce a day. That's 7 ounces per week. But I don't think pregnant women need a whole lot more liver than that per week. And that's well below those recommendations. If you go down the rabbit hole, and I've done a few podcasts on that, it's questionable whether higher doses of vitamin A would even be problematic for women with their babies. And I think that in general, it's pretty safe to say that vitamin A deficiency is 10 to 100 to 1,000 times more common than a vitamin A toxicity. Having said that, I don't recommend that people eat 6 pounds of liver or go in search of carnivore liver or polar bear liver. There's this anecdotal sort of wives' tale, or I should say urban myth about, it's actually not an urban myth, just this urban legend of polar bear liver, which actually does have quite a bit of vitamin A, but I believe it has literally 100 times more vitamin A than a cow's liver. So you can imagine 1 ounce of cow's liver is equivalent to 100 ounces of polar bear liver, I reverse those. So, 1 ounce of polar bear liver is 100 ounces of cow's liver. That's an insane amount. So even when you're looking at that level, 2 orders of magnitude higher vitamin A in polar bear liver, that could give somebody vitamin A toxicity, but I don't think anybody's eating 100 ounces of liver or pounds of liver per day chronically. Yeah. That's where you might run into issues.
I think if you're doing that intuitively, you would never do that. Like,
that's not
something that someone would strive for,
Yeah. I think the intuition would be really helpful there.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the copper thing, copper is interesting. A lot of people might be copper deficient. DAO is a copper dependent enzyme. So diamine oxidase in the human body is copper dependent. There's superoxide, which is a zinc copper dependent enzyme. So superoxide dismutase is an important enzyme that has to do with sort of the antioxidant system in the body, and that is dependent on copper. Copper is essential for human life. It's just getting the Goldilocks amount. And liver does have a lot of copper, but liver also has a lot of zinc, which should balance the copper. I think if you're eating liver in those moderate amounts, you won't get copper toxic, but very few people talk about copper deficiency. And I think that is also an issue for people. One thing that comes up increasingly now in the post-viral or the world that we live in post-COVID is that people are taking lots and lots of zinc as a supplement because they believe, somewhat rightly so, that a lot of people are not getting enough zinc, probably because they're not eating enough muscle meat. But if you take a lot of unopposed zinc, you can give yourself a copper deficiency. There's a protein in the intestines called metallothionein, which binds both copper and zinc. It kind of helps us to balance that ratio. And if you take a lot of zinc without copper in it, then you can deplete yourself of copper. And copper deficiency looks a lot like B12 deficiency. You can get tabes dorsalis or posterior column signs in the neurologic, in the spinal cord. You can get dementias, you can get balance issues and paresthesias in your extremities. So copper deficiency is no joke. And I hear about this all the time. People are taking now 50 milligrams plus of zinc per day because they're worried about a virus. And then if long-term, that can lead to problems with hormones and copper deficiency. So I think the best thing is just to get your zinc from meat and organs, and then also to get your copper from a little bit of liver throughout the week at those doses. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I keep hearing from a lot of different health experts online that anemia isn't really anemia. It's just a copper deficiency. But then again, nobody's talking about organ meats. So it's like, but if we added those in, then why are we even having this conversation? Because you're getting both of those things. And I think it could bring us to a really good topic, because everybody that is listening to this might not have a midwife. And so when I'm looking at somebody's blood work, it's going to be completely different than how a standard obstetrician would be looking at blood work. And so typically what is taught throughout medical school and how we treat our patients is that we run just a standard CBC, which is a complete blood count, and we look at hemoglobin and hematocrit. And basically what we're told, and even in my licensure, the guidelines from the California Medical Board, it says that if anybody has a hemoglobin under 10.0, they can't have a home birth. And so it's something that we actually have to use and look at. And I think CBCs are just really easy, great pieces of information just for a little snippet of everything. But we have this common perception that, anemia and pregnancy go hand in hand, but I don't think there's a lot of people that talk about the reason why they go hand in hand. And the part of the reason is, yes, there's probably lots of different deficiencies because we're not eating for optimal nutrition for the last 100 years, because we've moved away from that farm to table type of eating. But the hemodilution that happens in pregnancy lowers those hemoglobin levels because of the blood diluting throughout the pregnancy. So for me, I always do what's called an obstetrical panel at the beginning of pregnancy. And I get a baseline for what those hemoglobin and hematocrit levels look like. And I actually expect a drop. We want to see those levels drop, because if it doesn't drop, that tells me that there hasn't been the hemodilution, which is a woman's blood doubling, because when she gives birth, she loses blood. And we want to have that doubling of blood so she has those reserves, if you will, postpartum. And so I could have somebody that starts the pregnancy with a normal hemoglobin of 11.5, which to me is low, but they feel great. And then I could have somebody start the pregnancy at 13.5, and they start the hemodilution process and drop to less than a point and feel like absolute crap. Whereas somebody that drops from 11.5 might not really feel much of a difference. And so I kind of want to make sure that the people that are listening know that there is a physiological reason for there to be anemia in pregnancy. But if you are using an animal-based diet and you're using the nutrition of maybe not eating raw liver in your first trimester, but taking those desiccated capsules, that you're going to have more of an optimal experience throughout the pregnancy, and you won't feel those effects of the hemodilution as much as you would if you were just eating, oatmeal and bagels, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's just an anecdote, but my sister has 2 children, and her second pregnancy, she did not become anemic at all. At that point, I think that she was using heart and soil supplements and getting a lot more meat. And after the pregnancy, my mom thought, wow, it was amazing that my sister, that your sister Paul didn't become, my sister's name is Mary Catherine, that Mary Catherine didn't become anemic in her pregnancy. And I was like, oh, that's great. It's really cool. I don't think that women need to become anemic, but it's so common in my OB rotations in medical school to see that this anemia of pregnancy because of this hemodilution. And I think a lot of women are borderline anemic with low ferritin or low iron in general, ferritin being a storage form of iron throughout their lives. And then they become pregnant and it just kicks them over the edge, because I don't think women in general eat enough meat. It's an interesting question. A couple of questions for you. What do you do when women get nausea in the first trimester? I've heard about that a few times. There was a woman, we did an animal-based gathering here in Costa Rica a few months ago, and a woman came who was in her first trimester, and she had some pretty severe nausea. And I'm curious what you've seen for that and what's helpful.
Yeah, nausea is a really hard one because even if there's recommendations that I make, the compliance factor around it is really, really low because at that point, women are really just moving through their pregnancies in survival. Um, the the things that I see, so actually, I'm going to give you a really great anecdotal story. So I recently just had a mom who is on pregnancy number 3, and her kids are pretty close together. So she's probably mineral depleted just because of having such close together pregnancies. And this pregnancy, she was like just feeling awful. Like she was just like dragging, like, what's wrong with me? And then she really focused on doing this animal-based diet. So she was, doing livers and raw milks, and she started incorporating oysters in, and she just really was trying to make herself feel better. And immediately she started feeling better. And she was like, actually, this is the greatest I've ever felt out of all my pregnancies. And we just found out recently she didn't have a prenatal ultrasound. And when I measured her at 32 weeks pregnant, her belly was measuring close to a full-term pregnancy. And I was like, we got to do an ultrasound, and she's having twins. And so really she should be a person that even with supplementing these extra things still continue to kind of feel like crap because she was carrying 2 babies, but it turned her around so quick. So those are always my recommendations. Like I said, the compliancy of people actually doing it might be a different thing. And then I also try not to bring in that guilt factor that first trimester, because if someone feels bad, like if the only thing they can get down is, I don't know, like say beans and cheese or something like that, then they're living with themselves day to day. And if that's what makes them get out of bed, then that's what makes them get out of bed. But I feel like if we address it, if I have the opportunity to address it prenatally, preconception, I should say, and get those optimal stores of all of those nutrients built up, that I see so much of those women not have such a bad first trimester nausea, morning sickness. And it really just makes them kind of cruise through that first trimester instead of not be able to get out of bed.
That's a really important observation. I'll just reiterate it so everybody understands that. I think that the hypothesis here would be that preconception nutritional status may determine the quality of the first trimester of the pregnancy and could be helpful in terms of preventing things like nausea, et cetera, in women. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know what study it is off the top of my head. I can find it, but I remember reading something somewhere that said that with each pregnancy that our women's mineral depletion goes down about 10% with each pregnancy. And so, think of this, like mom was third pregnancy, pregnant with third and fourth babies, close pregnancy, like her mineral depletion was so down. So the second that she built that back up, she started feeling so much better. But let's do that before. Like if you're thinking about conceiving, like let's really get those nutrient dense, minerals into your system beforehand. And then that leads us, we can talk about preconception, because I think that's something that your male listeners would be interested in as well, because infertility issues are across the board right now. It's not just female infertility, it's male infertility as well. And so what are your thoughts on, not only your supplements and stuff like that, but what you're seeing is there any research out there with animal-based diets in terms of infertility?
Well, nothing formal with animal-based diets, but certainly with meat and organs, I think you can see a pretty clear correlation in the research between the consumption of animal foods and fertility. That's known. And we can see throughout the literature, most of it's observational because these are hard studies to do in terms of randomized and controlled studies that are actually interventional. But there's lots of observational epidemiology to suggest that overall human health is better with animal foods, that people are taller, which is an indication of overall health, that lifespan is better with animal foods.
Yes.
And there's a correlation there with the financial status of a country as well. But in countries that have better economies, people generally eat more animal foods in tandem. So it's pretty clear, I think, that animal foods result in better nutrition for humans. It's really strange to me that in the United States and parts of the Western world, it's very in vogue and perhaps increasingly, or sadly, increasingly politically correct to shun animal foods when most of the developing world knows without a doubt that things like beans or grains or leafy greens are just survival food, and they're not ideal for humans. Yeah. They're not ideal for men.
They're fillers.
Yeah, they're fillers. They're not ideal for men or women. They're certainly not ideal for women that want to conceive, and they're not ideal in pregnancy. And there's all sorts of reports in the literature that never get talked about by plant-based news sources of all kinds of nutritional deficiencies in the developing world related to overconsumption of things like cassava, which is a root that has many anti-nutrients, cyanogenic glycosides, isothiocyanates, et cetera, and grains, and just it's prevalent and it's just pervasive. And I had Diana Rogers on the podcast a few months ago, and she said something that I thought was quite striking, that throughout the world, and this is a bit of a digression, so we won't go too far down the rabbit hole, but throughout the developing world, people are starving, but there's not really a calorie deficiency. We have enough calories to feed people in the world, but we don't have enough nutrients. And we don't have enough minerals and vitamins, and we can try and fake it with vitamin and mineral supplements, but that doesn't work as well as real food because we often can't fake things that we don't know exist. This is what's so interesting to me about animal foods, meat and organs in particular, is that there are nutrients in liver and heart and spleen and pancreas and kidney and, intestines and brain and testicle that we don't even know about as humans, that people just have always eaten intuitively because they were looking to honor the whole animal and didn't want to waste anything calorically. And so there's all these nutrients that we don't even know about, whether they're peptides or, precursor molecules or hormones or hormone precursors that are valuable for humans that we cannot ever synthesize. We can't recreate in a multivitamin. We can't recreate in a synthetic prenatal multivitamin, which we should have mentioned earlier, has usually folic acid in it rather than folate.
Which is a huge problem.
Yeah, there's a real interesting thing here about this. This is a really important thing that we should touch on in this podcast. The idea that there is research to suggest that, well, number one, folic acid does not occur in nature. It's a synthetic form of folate. It doesn't occur anywhere. So there's no requirement for folic acid in the human body, but all the supplements contain folic acid, probably because it's the most stable form. But in the human body, there's L5 methylfolate, there's 5,10 methyl tetrahydrofolate, there's tetrahydrofolate, there's all sorts of forms of folate that are actually biologically identical. And if those occur in your prenatal, then you have a prenatal that's better than one with folic acid. But there's this potential that a prenatal containing folic acid might even do negative things in some people. I don't know if we have enough research to say that with full confidence, but I would never take folic acid. And I imagine that you recommend against folic acid to your clients as well.
100%. That's the first thing I ask somebody when they come in, like, what are you taking? And I start by saying that I would like to see them before they get pregnant so they know not to take this anyways. But if they're coming in and I haven't met them yet, like if they're taking any supplement that contains folic acid, I tell them to get off it immediately. And most of the time they're like, oh, what do you mean? I'm supposed to take folic acid. I'm being a good mom. And you're like, yes, but that's not what we want you on. So we know nowadays that it's harmful. Like it's not what we want to use for, pregnant women. And it's just given out like candy, like you go to any store and that's prenatal and it's folic acid, doctor after doctor, folic acid. It's very harmful, especially if you haven't been tested for MTHFR. And then it's just completely wreaking havoc on your system.
Do you get a lot of women coming to you who are hesitant to increase their meat or are vegetarian or semi-vegetarian or eat a lot of salads? And if so, what's it like how do you help them understand the importance of animal foods in the diet?
Yeah, I again kind of go back to intuitive eating, and I ask women before I really start to integrate adding stuff back in that women have been told not to eat about what they're craving. And, what sounds really good to you? Like if you could go eat anything right now, what sounds good to you? And 9 times out of 10, it's a steak or it's, something to do with a meat product. And I'm like, okay, that's good. Like what does that tell you? Like, do you think your body needs that? And then they have the little light bulb go off. Like, I'm going to go eat a steak tonight. So as long as you bring it in intuitively, it's funny because you wouldn't actually think that, like with the anecdotal observation, that you would think that many women would be like, no, I need to go eat meat, but it's almost every single time. So, and even my vegetarian vegans, they're like, oh no, I'll go eat steak once they're given permission, they're like, oh, I'm going to go do that. So, it's again, I have the cream of the crop for clients because they're coming into it a little bit more health conscious than the average person. But that health conscious nowadays doesn't mean animal based. Most people think health conscious is plant based. So it's a little bit of reversal of this paradigm shift that we're in.
That's what we're trying to do. I mean, that's why I do the work I do. And I think that's a big part of the work that you do too, is trying to really change that paradigm and help people understand that an animal-based diet is much more evolutionarily consistent for humans than a plant-based diet. And it's an uphill battle, but I think it's a very valuable one. Why do you think women fear meat so much? I don't really have experience with this. I mean, I can ask my sister, but I grew up a boy, and so I didn't get this same sort of programming that you get or that your clients get as women. But I'm just curious if you have any insight into that. Why do you think it's so hard for women to break out of that and to appreciate meat? Are women told that salads keep them skinny and beautiful, or they think meat is going to age them? Or what's the narrative here? Why are so many women into salads and so afraid of meat?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a diet culture surrounding this, right? Like we have this stigma that women need to have this, slim body and diet all the time and restrict ourselves from different nutrients. And, if you look commonly throughout history, the women that look like Kate Moss in the 1990s are the women that would be the first to die if there was ever a famine, because there's no reserves, there's no health there. Not that Kate Moss will ever listen to this, but I'm sure she's healthier now.
Hopefully, I don't know.
But it's one of those things that that if we reverse the stigma of what healthy is, and we step into really learning and knowing what we need to consume to get us through pregnancy, to get us through postpartum, to get us through nursing and into menopause, it's essential that we know that these building blocks are going to set us up with success for the rest of our lives, because women are different than men. Our bodies operate different than you guys. We bleed every single month, where men don't have that as a problem. So I would say that, us getting those nutrient dense foods is not only critical, it's essential for our health.
It's I couldn't have said it better. It's absolutely essential, I think, for men and women in their health. And as I said at the beginning of the podcast, people ask me all the time, can women do an animal-based diet? And let this podcast be the first ringing clarion call that absolutely yes. And it's probably the ideal thing for women as well. I've got some content coming about that on social media soon too. But what about birth control? Do you see women coming off birth control with fertility issues? How do you address that? Have you had success in your practice with that?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing, because I feel like birth control is just like the candy pill that everybody's prescribed and popped. You go into the doctor when you're 16 and say that you have cramps and some zits, and they just give you birth control pills. And I don't know one of my friends that wasn't on birth control pills when we were in high school. It was cool if you were on birth control. And there was never any risks addressed with what it could do to us. Recently, there was a documentary that was just done by Ricky Lake. I think it was called The Business of Birth Control. She did a one called The Business of Birth as well, if you ever want to deep dive into, the problem with maternity care in the United States. But it's a whole probably 90-minute long documentary on the risks associated with birth control. And we really want to have women off of birth control preconception for months to remineralize their body, so to speak, because of how much depletion has happened. But in my practice, I don't prescribe birth control for postpartum. If somebody wants to not get pregnant, or have that spacing in between their next child, we go straight to talking about natural family spacing. And I have 100% breastfeeding rate. So that usually comes with amenorrhea, which is one of the, nature's best birth control, so to speak. And then once they do get their cycles back, we go into the different wonderful apps that are available now with technology, with monitoring basal body temperature, knowing the signs of ovulation. I wish I could teach that at every high school. Why aren't we learning that in health class in high school? What's happening to our bodies? That's a really important thing to know. But it's something that's not really talked about. So, when we do start to reverse the damage that's done with birth control, which is done very quickly, I believe, with an animal-based diet, then we do see the fertility rates going up a lot more. But that's such a small piece to that question, because I feel like we could talk so much more about fertility and just knowing our bodies. That's such an important thing to know, what our bodies are doing, because we're so out of tune with those natural cycles and rhythms that relate to the natural rhythms of the earth. Can
you say a few more words about that? I mean, I guess I think that a lot of women listening to this may be familiar, maybe men who are in relationships with women who are on birth control are curious about this, but talk a little bit about the temperature changes throughout the month with ovulation. And if women are listening to this and they're not familiar with temperature methods or methods of avoiding or planning for pregnancy, just knowing when you are fertile and not fertile without using something like exogenous estrogen and progesterone? What can women do for that? How can they educate themselves? And what information is really there?
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of information there. So the OG Bible of natural fertility is called Natural Family Planning. And recently there's been a few apps that have come out. Daisy is one of probably the most popular ones. And they send you a thermometer and then the app that goes with it. And it constantly, you do your temperature at the same time every single morning, and it watches for the rise and the fall to do with, your fertile peaks. And it tells you ding, 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 you're fertile. Either have sex or don't, depending on if you want a baby or not. And a lot of times women are linking this up onto their partners' phones. So their partners are included in this conversation about fertility and child planning. So they know when there's that fertile window, and, ways to be different with their ways of showing affection and love can happen at that time if they're not wanting a baby, or ways to be really fun and creative and, sacredly bring this baby into the world where, it's a conscious conception, which isn't even something that's normally talked about in our culture because we're so far away from just the thought of a conscious conception where we can invite a being into this space. So I would start with those two, the book, the Natural Family Planning and Daisy. There's other apps. I don't know the names off the top of my head, but those are really good resources to have for fertility for sure.
And so my understanding about this, and maybe you can educate me on this, is that, there's this, when women starts her period, that's day one of her cycle. She may have menstruation for 3 to 5 days. Anecdotally, I hear from women that dietary changes can improve the quality of menstruation and help with premenstrual issues and menstrual cramping. Moving beyond that, the cycle moves toward ovulation, which is, on day 14 usually, or whatever of the cycle.
Ish,
and that, but what I learned in medical school was that a woman is fertile for a few days before ovulation, and then maybe 1 or 2 days after. Is this true? Did I learn correctly? And is that when you're going to see, when do you think you would see the basal body temperature rise? Is it just before ovulation? And can you give us a sense of that?
I
don't know these things.
It's yes, it's true. That's typically that's the textbook version of what happens, but every woman has such a different cycle. So yes, day one is the first day of that period. It can last sometimes 3 to 10 days, depending on the cycle. If we're going into 10 days, there's something wrong. So you want to look into that. And then some people have really long cycles. Some women cycle on day 40, and that means their ovulation is going to be different. So you're looking for, getting a few good months of finding a baseline for your system. So I always say, don't ask me what's normal, because what's normal to you is going to be different from everybody else. Go and find your normal. And then it puts that control back into the hands of the patient, which is what Western medicine has taken away. But I feel is a critical piece to moving away from this matrix of where we're at right now in the world with medicine.
It's empowering, I think, to women and their partners to know that they can plan pretty darn well for pregnancy without birth control, without hormonal birth control. And then, I knew a lot of women growing up who had copper IUDs, and you think, you want to put copper in your uterus? That just I
don't think we even know the implications of that yet. I don't think there's anything for us to say this is what's causing it. But the more I'm down the copper rabbit hole, I'm like, oh man, what is that doing? We just don't know.
We just don't know. And then this is a conversation that obviously is very personal, and we will leave to every listener and every couple of listeners, that are interested in this podcast to make their own decisions, but just to provide some sort of the educational tools was my only goal. Not judging people if they choose to use birth control or hormonal birth control, but only trying to make them aware of the fact that may have negative hormonal side effects. And as you indicated, as you suggested, something that's very rarely talked about, the negative, potentially mineral and nutrient side effects of birth control are not to be ignored. So that is an important thing to consider as well. And then I just wanted to highlight again something that we touched on earlier, so that it doesn't get glossed over: the fact that a pregnancy is going to use many of your nutrients. And so if you are, as a woman, getting pregnant close together, that is going to be a nutrient, burden. It's going to good things. It's going to healthy babies. But it's interesting anthropologically or historically that there is this idea that at least women used to breastfeed much longer, and that
Thank you. I was just going to say that. So the anthropological timeline of breastfeeding is usually averaged anywhere from 3 to 4 years in most cultures.
Wow.
And so that was the time where we would see natural family spacing. So natural family spacing, like I said, amenorrhea is a lack of a period. And so if we have somebody that's breastfeeding 3 to 4 years and they don't have a period, they're not going to get pregnant. So that gives us that time, even though, yes, a mom is nursing is different depletion than a pregnancy and birth would be. So we did see throughout time this natural family spacing of about 3.5 years. Recently, there was an article I was looking at, and it was looking at famous actors and actresses in the birth order. So it was a picture of all the different kids, and you could tell the difference between the first kid and the fourth kid just based on looks. And what the article was saying is that the mineral depletion in the mom had different characteristics of how those kids looked coming out as the first, robust, healthy kid compared to maybe the more meek and frail fourth or fifth kid or second kid or whatever. But, that does matter. It matters. It's such an important thing. And, I can look at moving into not just that, the brothers and the sisters, but then you look at down like the line of like, what if you give birth to a daughter, like she has the eggs that are inside of her for her children. And so we're talking about future generations as well. So, my mom was born in 1950 and my grandma, her mom was giving diet pills throughout her whole pregnancy. My mom was born 2 months premature in 1950. And so I think about like, diet pills, like what the hell was her nutrition like? But that's also the like foundation of like how I was my blueprint of my nutrition, because that's where I was kind of set up as well. My mom's eggs had me as like this little egg in there that we have to think long-term here, people. Like we can't just think of this generation. We have to think of all of the generations and future generations, I should say. And I would say it's the same for men. I mean, it's not exactly the same with our eggs and everything like that, but we want to have that mineral rich, nutrient rich blueprint for future generations.
I love that. It's so important for women to understand that. I mean, whether you're having a boy or a girl, your pre-pregnancy nutrition, your during pregnancy nutrition, your post-pregnancy nutrition is important. If you're having a girl, then all of your nutrition will be written into her eggs. All of the eggs that she will have, all the follicles will be there when your baby girl is born, and your baby's ovaries and all of that nutritional history that the mom has during pregnancy, pre-pregnancy is written into her baby girl's eggs. And then that's carried on to the future generations. That's a striking thought that I hadn't considered. Men are making sperm and spermatogonia throughout their lives. So we're not necessarily born with all of our sperm at any one time, but still that pregnancy and that pre-pregnancy nutrition will be critical for both men and women as children in their babies. So it's so important. It's critical. I think that it's just, hopefully the women listening to this that are thinking about getting pregnant are heading for the fridge right now to cook a steak or to grab some liver or some kind of organs. And anyone who is pregnant is doing the same thing. And people who are post-pregnancy are doing the same thing. It's just like, I hope everybody's getting really hungry for steaks. It's so interesting to hear that when you give your vegan or vegetarian clients permission, that they will often admit that they do want steak and they want animal foods. This is the statistic that's so interesting. I think that written into our brains as humans, deep within our brains, is programming that says animal foods are essential for optimal human health. And even if your conscious awareness is something that doesn't want to eat animal foods because you think it's cruel or whatever, that's a whole separate conversation. Even deep in your brain, your body still knows those foods are essential for human life, for human thriving, for human vitality, because of the unique nutrients they contain that are not found in plant foods. And we just can't erase that programming in our brains, thankfully. And so when vegetarians or vegans get drunk, so many, like 30-40% of them eat meat.
They'll go binge.
Yeah, they go binge. They eat. They have this craving. They can't get rid of it. How interesting is that? There were a few more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to say a really quick story that I thought was really interesting. I had a pretty famous like vegan chef that was one of my clients, and she had really low platelets. So the California Medical Board says we can't have a home birth if platelets are under 100, which is, I agree with that. I don't want, to have somebody that has low platelets at a home birth situation. And she's like, what can I do? And I, was telling her all these different things. I'm like, you have to eat meat. Like, I don't care if this is your job and your profession, you got to go eat meat. And she did. And what happened? Her platelets went up.
You hear this all the time. I've heard this,
Yeah.
before with people with low platelets, that their platelets got much better once they started eating meat. And then sometimes this ITP or these low platelets, this immunologic syndrome, idiopathic thrombocytopenia purpura, this idiopathic.
Which my dad has.
Really? Yeah. This is connected with autoimmunity. And one of the things that's fascinating for me about an animal-based diet is that it does help with a lot of these autoimmune conditions. It's not a panacea. It doesn't work every time, but for some people, there's a question, are you not eating enough meat? Are you not eating enough organs? Or are some of these vegetables that everyone thinks are healthy for humans causing this autoimmune reaction to you? That's probably the most controversial position that I hold, but I think I've seen it work. There were a few questions in the document that you had from your followers that I wanted to make sure we addressed. One of them was, is a carnivore diet safe to follow for children? And I'll address that briefly if it's okay. I think that I would recommend animal-based for kids rather than carnivore. I think carbohydrates are important for children. I would not make your kids keto all the time. I think that if I use my niece and nephew as any indication, you can feed them strawberries and blueberries and hamburger pretty much all day, every day. They'll eat even more of it if you put butter on it. So there you've got, and if you put an egg in there too, they're just happy as a clam. And maybe if you put some honey in there, they're still.
Honey. I was going to say honey.
Yeah. Raw honey isn't good for babies that are less than 1 year old, according to medical recommendations. So be a little careful with that. But you could feed my niece and nephew honey and hamburger and fruit and egg yolks and butter all day. And you could sprinkle some liver pills on top and they would be little mutant Marvel X-Men and X-Women. That's a pretty darn good diet for kids. So that'll work just great. I think you're not going to have any trouble feeding your kid hamburger with honey on it.
No.
And you're going to feel really good about that. And then the other question was, if fruit isn't in season where you live, should you skip it? I think the answer is no. I'll let people use their intuition if they feel like their intuition is finely honed to answer that question individually. I think that we have come from humans that were equatorial and that had access to some sort of carbohydrates year round. I think in general, humans do better with carbohydrates from the least toxic plant sources. In my mind, that's fruit and honey. And so I think that even if you live somewhere where fruit isn't in season, I would still get some fruit and some honey in your diet. I think you'll feel better. But and maybe there was one more. Let's see here. Is it okay to take supplements while breastfeeding? Yes, absolutely.
100%. It helps so much with energy, with breastfeeding. And a thing that I think we should address too is the postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety aspect of it. Yeah. Our brains are starving. Like our brains are completely starving. And so we just gave birth, we just released blood, our hormones are changing. And if we are getting all of those nutrients back in, it's sure as hell going to help with improving, those mood disorders postpartum.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that the takeaway here for people is don't fear meat, don't fear organs, get the animal foods, get some carbohydrates. Organs. Yeah. I was joking with a friend of mine today that I'm going to make an energy drink, and the energy drink is going to be goat's milk. We had some garbage energy drinks because we're going to do some social media content about how energy drinks are bullshit. It's like, I'm going to make an energy drink, an animal-based energy drink, and it's going to have goat's milk, and it's going to have liver and heart and testicle and raw meat. And you're going to pop a can. It's going to be this like smoothie of energy drink, like mixed raw organs and fruit. And anyway, that's your real energy drink.
I love it. That's amazing.
So anything we didn't address that you want to get to? I think we've covered a lot of stuff.
I think we've covered so much. And, if there's lots of questions that come from this, we can always have a follow-up.
Absolutely.
But we went through a lot. So, we'll let this settle with everybody and kind of go from there.
Cool. Where can people find you?
My Instagram is my name. It's a tricky one to spell, but I'm sure you'll link it. So it's Lindsey Meehleis. And that's probably the best place to find me, is Lindsey Meehleis on Instagram. And then my website as well is lindseymeehleis.com.
And your last name is spelled Meehleis. And this is
Correct.
Lindsey with an EY. So people can find you on Instagram. Thank you so much for coming on. It was a great conversation. I think it's going to help a lot of women. And I look forward to people tagging me in pictures of their amazing children in the future, perhaps amazing children that have come from some of the nuggets from this conversation. I'll just end with this anecdote that a few years ago, I had a friend of mine who asked me to do a consult for one of his friends whose wife was pregnant. And, we talked about the pregnancy stuff. We talked about the wife getting meat and organs. We talked about how to feed the kid afterward. And every year, this is probably 2 or 3 years ago, every year my friend sends me photos of his friend's son who is precocious and athletic and loves liver and eats tons of meat and organs and fruit and is just freaking thriving. And it's an anecdote, but it's just so cool. I think of all the things that I do, some of the most satisfying anecdotes to hear are either people who, and we've heard this from Heart and Soil, through Heart and Soil as well, people who were infertile, who struggled with fertility for a long time. They said they tried everything, acupuncture, herbs, whatever, vegan diets, crystals, full moon, whatever, ceremonies,
whatever it is out there.
Yeah. They try everything. And then they started an animal-based diet, sometimes using fresh organs, sometimes using desiccated organs from Heart and Soil, and they conceive. And it's so cool to think that, that some of the work that I do and that you do, especially the work that you do, could help humans come into the world in a better fashion and have a better quality of life. That's just so exciting to think about. And if I, ever have kids, it's exciting to think that I have some information to help make that process good too. And maybe I'll have some mutants and there'll be X-Men and X-women.
I love it. And another thing I think people should tag us in is their placentas. Let's see some healthy placentas. We could put together some really cool images and really show the difference between those hearty meat-eating placentas and the vegetarian placentas.
I love it. We'll have lots of tags with some really meaty placentas and see if Instagram censors that.
I love it.
Thanks again for coming on.
Of course. Take care. Thank you.